With that, I'll start my talk. Coming from a complicated wide QRS tachycardia, my presentation for today will be on utility of an ECG in non-cardiac conditions, a case-based approach. As you see, during the previous interactions, we had a lot of questions on this. So I thought of taking this part of ECG, which may be very interesting and very important for a clinician point of view. Today's topic, I'm going to cover few of this. You know very well there are a lot of changes drugs can cause on ECG. There are some non-cardiac conditions which have a significant impact on the ECG. And we have few ECG mimics. You know very well that patients with pneumothorax can have an ST elevation. Patients with acute cholecystitis presents with ST changes in ECGs. And patients with acute pancreatitis, there are case reports which are present with a significant ST changes that people mistook for myocardial infarction. So these are typical ECG mimics. You see a patient with subarachnoid hemorrhage. We have seen a lot of patients. One of the cardinal electrocardiogram sign is a T-wave inversions, huge T-wave inversions in anterior leads. See, I'm not going to see all of this because we know very well that most of them are clinical diagnosis. Whenever you are reading a ECG, most important thing is never look at ECG in isolation. Whenever I get a ECG for reading, also I always say, give me a background history and all that, because ECG has to be read along with a history. Just looking at a ECG and making diagnosis is not right. So another most important part of electrocardiogram, which is very useful, is electrolyte imbalance. We can get a lot of information on this by looking at a ECG. We have a lot of drugs and toxins which have direct effect on heart. All these toxins can have a ECG changes. There are some cardiac toxins like oleander, which can cause bradycardias and ventricular arrhythmias. And there are toxins which can cause bradycardia if they are acting on vagal system. And most of the toxins, irrespective of their action, can have a sinus tachycardia because just an anxiety could be the reason. And specific toxins, according to the way they act, will have a manifestation on ECG. There are a lot of things to be talked on this, so I'll select few cases and go through that cases. If any specific questions you make, I'll try to answer it in the Q&A session. So I'll keep this format as a case-based approach because I thought this is a clinical question, so we'll go clinically. This is a 72-year-old female, had a recent TKR. On a post-op day 4, we have been called for a sudden onset of breathlessness. Chest X-ray was completely normal, already seen by a physician. Chest X-ray was normal. Patient is hypoxic, saturating close to 70 to 80% on room air with a hypotension. BP is around 90 systolic. By now, we'd have made a picture on our mind what we are looking at. So the ECG was taken. This was a ECG. Just looking at the ECG, everybody would have jumped to the diagnosis. We know very well what is this ECG is all about. So you just look at this ECG, it's a typical S1, Q3, T3 with not so good progression on the V1 to V4. If you see, there's a significant prominent right ventricular pattern. Your left ventricle has not seen clearly on this ECG. So this is typical of a acute massive pulmonary thromboembolism. You see here, I've made it a little more obvious. You can clearly see a S1, Q3, T3 pattern. There is a deep S in lead 1. There is a T-wave inversion in lead 3, along with a deep or somewhat Q-wave in a lead 3. This is a constellation of all three signs. We call them as S1, Q3, T3. Other things you always look at in patients who present these kind of finding is looking at RV strain. This RV strain can present in multiple ways in your ECG. You can see a right bundle branch block pattern, either complete or incomplete. You can have T-wave inversions in the anterior leads like V1 to V3, which we usually look at as a right ventricular leads. This T-wave inversion can be present from V1 to V6. And you can see the lateral R waves are not that prominent. We usually see a prominent R waves in V4 to V6, but they are not seen. These are the signs that your right ventricle is strained out. So one of the common reason for acute onset of RV strain pattern is pulmonary thromboembolism. So whenever you look at a ECG with pulmonary thromboembolism, what you are looking at is a RV strain. These are the clinical, when you see clinically a pulmonary thromboembolism, these are the ECG manifestations of a RV strain. You always remember ECG is helpful in diagnosing RV strain and pulmonary thromboembolism, but a normal ECG never rules out pulmonary thromboembolism. This is a additive or adjunctive finding in patients with pulmonary embolism. This is very important. When you look at pulmonary thromboembolism diagnosis by ECG, most often you see a non-specific ST changes and a tachycardia. The sinus tachycardia is a very prominent and most common sign. You can see close to 50% of the patients with pulmonary thromboembolism have sinus tachycardia. And you can have RV strain patterns, which is very suggestive of a severe pulmonary embolism. You can have inverted T waves from V1 to V4. You can have a QR in V1, incomplete or complete right bundle branch block pattern, and the classical S1 Q3 T3. You have to understand that this is seen in 20%. That is, if the patient has a massive pulmonary embolism and has a severe RV strain, close to 20 to 30% of the patients can have a SQ3 Q3 T3 pattern. That means presence of this gives you a clue. Absence of this does not exclude a pulmonary thromboembolism. So pulmonary thromboembolism is a clinical diagnosis aided by electrocardiogram. The next one is a 20-year-old primigravida. Gravida. This has a lot of relevance now with the present situation of COVID. Patient had a fever, jaundice, and altered sensorium for 5 days. GCS was 12/15. Blood smear for positive for Plasmodium falciparum. A diagnosis of a cerebral malaria was made. The huge parasitic index of 10%. The patient was started on a quinine infusion. On day 2, patient developed a sudden hypotension. BP is hardly 80 with a heart rate more than 200. It's a clear-cut Torsades. So it's a polymorphic VT. You can see a ST. You can see a ECG here. There is a polymorphic VT. We typically call it Torsades or rolling around along the axis. This is typical of a ECG due to a QT prolongation. You compare with this a monomorphic VT. I think Arun has discussed in detail about white QRS tachycardias. It's a monomorphic VT where you can see every QRS complex resembles each other. If you look at any lead, the previous, preceding, following QRS complexes resemble each other. They all along the same axis. Compare with this ECG, there's a complete change in axis nearly in every beat. This looks like this is a polymorphic VT. So this patient has developed a polymorphic VT secondary to the drug. So these polymorphic VTs immediately requires a defibrillation as a ventricular fibrillation because this is hemodynamically unstable. The drug of choice remains IV Xalocaine because we have most of the antiarrhythmics which are QT prolonging. The most common reason you will develop these kind of polymorphic VTs are due to metabolic disturbance. And this is, you know very well, people who are seeing cardiac patients regularly will know that one of the earliest manifestations of cardiac ischemia, coronary artery disease, which is presenting as a myocardial ischemia, could be a polymorphic VT. So these are the most common reasons why you will see a polymorphic VT. This can be associated with a prolonged QT. Whenever a polymorphic VT is associated with a prolonged QT interval, we call them as a Torsades de Pointes. So a polymorphic VT is most commonly secondary to a metabolic disturbance, drugs, or cardiac ischemia, which have an act on cardiac repolarization. So Torsades de Pointes, if you see, when you have a polymorphic VT associated with a longer QTs, there is an increased risk whenever your QT extends beyond 500 milliseconds. And if your QT goes beyond 600 milliseconds, you have a very high risk of developing a Torsades de Pointes. This is particularly true in female patients. They are very susceptible to Torsades. And when you have patients with QT prolongation, give a drug which can further increase the QT, like what presently happening whenever you are giving a chloroquine or azithromycin on a patient for a treatment of a COVID, you have to be very careful about your QT prolongation. QT has to be monitored regularly. We have a history of patients. We recently lost a young boy here who had a baseline QT prolongation, was given chloroquine and had a Torsades. So you have to be very careful whenever you use a QT prolonging drugs to make sure that you have seen a baseline QT. This is particularly important in younger patients because as you know, long QT syndrome, it's a congenital QT prolonging syndrome, which is more common in children. So whenever you are looking at children and treating them with any QT prolonging drug, your baseline ECG is a must. So most often your Torsades is frequently initiated after a pause. It's mostly iatrogenic, and this usually patient will have a background hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia. The patients can have a drugs which can prolong a QT, and usually it's a combination of these. You can have congenital long QTs. We know very well that there are a syndrome of long QT syndromes, which congenitally due to channelopathies, which can cause prolonged QT. You will have a lot of patients who have acquired, or we have seen patients who have a completely asymptomatic, never had a longer QT, suddenly started on some drug and it manifests itself. They may have an inapparent long QT syndrome, but slowly when you give us some drug which can prolong, or you cause some situation which prolongs QT, can end up in a QT prolongation and polymorphic VT Torsades T point. It's a dangerous one. If we don't treat properly, there's a possibility that you may lose the patient. There's a huge list of drugs which can cause QT prolongation. You always have in mind whenever you give a QT prolonging drug. You look at your drug chart, make sure that you are not mixing two QT prolonging drugs at the same time. And whenever you are going to use a QT prolonging drug, you know this drug is going to prolong the QT, make sure your electrolytes are in range. I always tell that whenever you have a drug which is going to prolong a QT, make sure your potassiums are in high normal side, you have a normal magnesium. The calcium, we don't check so frequently, but in susceptible patient, you may have to look at calcium and magnesium also. So the most important thing is looking at a potassium levels. Potassium has to be kept at a longer level, and before starting any QT prolonging drug, make sure you have a baseline ECG and monitor the QT regularly in these patients to avoid this disastrous consequence of a QT prolongation. How you treat these Dorsets? Most important thing is remove the offending agent immediately. Whatever the drug which can cause slightest QT prolongation also has to be pulled out. We have a list of drugs which can cause a tremendous QT prolongation, and we have drugs which are usually okay. We don't see lot of times. A lot of antibiotics can cause a little QT prolongation, but when you have already a QT prolongation, all offending drugs has to be taken off. Replete potassium. I love my potassium levels to be more than 4.5 in patients who have a longer QTs. Treat with magnesium even if normal. You see, it's very difficult to find out intracellular magnesium levels. You did a extracellular magnesium levels, which may be normal, close to normal. Still, patient can be depleted with the intracellular magnesium stores, which is more important for patient's action potential. So that is going to cause further trouble. So if you feel the magnesium levels are normal also, there is no harm in repleting magnesium as long as your renal function is good. If the patient has a good renal function, your infusion of magnesium is not going to cause much of trouble. You have always to increase the heart rate. Whenever your patient has a Torsades or longer QT, the worst thing here can have in association is a bradycardia. Always bradycardia increases QT furthermore, and patient will become more more susceptible to arrhythmias. So you try to increase your heart rate. So this is very important. So this is one of the very few situations we know about isoprenaline as a drug. We know very well from our experience from treating ischemic heart disease patient. A lot of you, I think, at least our earlier generation cardiologists and physicians will be well aware of this drug, particularly given in myocardial infarction patient. They are very pro-arrhythmic. I always say this is one of the very few situations where isoprenaline is used as an antiarrhythmic agent. You give an isoprenaline infusion, keep a heart rate more than 100, 110, so that QT interval remains stable, so the patient can be treated. Sometimes you may not be able to achieve that. We may have to put a temporary pacemaker and pace the heart more than 100 beats per minute. So keeping a heart rate higher is a treatment for a prolonged QT interval and Torsades. If you have a congenital long QT syndrome, you have treatment options available. We know very well there is a list of drugs, and beta blockers are extremely effective in type 1 and 2. And some of the patients who are not even symptomatic, even on beta blockers, may require a further treatment like ICD. But that's not part of my talk today. So we'll keep with repleting the electrolytes. And along with that, if you want, you can try to increase heart rate. So next one is a 60-year-old man had a CA stomach, underwent a total gastrectomy. 3 days later, he becomes breathless and febrile, had a multiple ventricular ectopics associated with hemodynamic instability. So cardiologist was called. He has been intubated. Most of the common causes have been ruled out. looking at a ventricular ectopics, cardiologist wanted to start a amiodarone infusion. He was started on amiodarone infusion. Next day, that's the ECG. So the patient has a complete heart block. You can see that AV dissociation. And what you can observe very clearly is background QRS prolongation. This patient already had a baseline biphasic block. He has been started on a amiodarone infusion. So patient developed a complete heart block. Patient has to be temporary pacemaker was done. The lower panel, you can see a temporary pacemaker has been done. And slowly his heart rate improved and TPA was taken out. So one thing you should always remember is most of the drugs, including your antiarrhythmics, can be pro-arrhythmic in particular patient. So all patients with amiodarone infusion, once stabilized, slowly overlap to oral and taper the infusion. Keep a close watch on conduction system. Although amiodarone is not as bad as your beta blockers or calcium channel blockers and conduction system, it can reduce the sinus rate. It can have an act on AV nodal tissue. So patients who have already a susceptible AV node or susceptible conduction system, patient can develop a high-grade AV block or significant bradycardia. So you should always be worried about this, particularly in patients who have multiple comorbidities. Patient had a liver dysfunction, particularly an ICU patient where half-life of amiodarone can be significantly prolonged. You may take a longer time for the amiodarone to return to normal levels so that your conduction system recovers. So be careful whenever you give any drug which is going to affect a conduction system. There's another patient, a 28-year-old female, had a post-MVR, admitted with AF with fast ventricular response, had a significant congestive heart failure. She was kept on high-dose diuretics. She required a pretty stiff dose. She was getting somewhere close to 180 to 200 mg of furosemide, and she was well under control with amiodarone. So we were thinking she's doing really great. We shifted her out of ICU. When we are shifting into lift, she had a cardiac arrest, revived. So ECG post-resuscitation, glaring. See, this patient had a significant prolongation of QT. What you have done, you have given a lot of diuretics. Along with that, patient was on amiodarone infusion. So this patient had a mile-long QT. You can see that QT interval is nearly obscuring the next P wave. You will hardly see a P wave, particularly in the precardial leads. This is a pretty long QT, and patient has developed a TARSETS. This is the recorded strip from the defibrillator. So the patient, if you look at the patient's reports, patient had a potassium of 3.6. I would say that's not very low, but you have a significant magnesium depletion also. Patient had a combined depletion of a magnesium and potassium, which caused a significant prolongation of QT. Along with that, you have a hypothyroidism. On top of all three, patient was on amiodarone infusion. So you have to be very careful when you have multiple factors which are going to cause a QT prolongation. Particularly cardiac patients, you know that we are particularly congestive cardiac patients, we are going to give a lot of diuretics. You are going to deplete good amount of magnesium stores, and patients supposed to have a potassium low also. In this patient, if you see, this patient was on a reasonable repletion of potassium. She was given potassium repletion in the form of oral potassium, but as long as you don't correct your magnesium, your potassium is never going to increase. So this patient was on borderline potassium all the time. Potassium was in the range of 3 to 3.5 all the time. So when you have these kind of patients who have a resistant hypokalemia, you would always look at magnesium levels and replete magnesium. The moment you will replete magnesium, the potassium levels will also improve. And when you have these kind of a situation, your TSH is 15. Normally, you may have wanted to wait for some time, do a lot of testing before starting a thyroid replacement. These kind of patients, you may be a little more aggressive in giving thyroxine, because these patients have so many factors which can prolong the QT. So QT interval measurement is very important. Every one of us should know how to measure a QT interval. This is very, very important. I think we had one extensive talk last week by Dr. Nadarajan sir, who explained extremely well on how to measure and how to look at QT intervals. QT intervals have to be measured from a start of QRS complex to the end of the T wave. What you are doing by this, you are measuring complete total ventricular activity. You are including depolarization, which is represented by a QRS, and repolarization, which is part of your SC segment and T wave. So you are measuring the total ventricular activity and total refractory time of your cardiac action potential. QT has to be corrected for rate, because QT is a dynamic thing. During a bradycardia, QT prolongs, tachycardia, QT shortens. So you have to measure and correct it with your heart rate. There are a lot of formulae for available for this correction. The most commonly used is Besset's. You measure a QT interval, RR interval. QT by square root of RR interval gives you a QT number. Most of your smartphones have algorithms. You have MDCal kind of an app which can immediately just measure your QT, measure your RR, put them in the formula. They will give you a QTC. If you are not having access to all this, you just measure your QT interval given by your automated ECG. Lot of times, the most common mistake in QTC measurement happens in the calculation of QT, because a lot of time your automated machines will not be able to clearly see the end of T wave. So they may overestimate or underestimate the QT interval. So if your automated machine gives a proper QT, your QTC will be correct, because RR interval is easily measured by your automated machine. So you just measure your QT interval in your ECG and see that your automated ECG has given a proper QT. If your QT interval of the automated ECG is correct, your QTC given by a automated machine is also correct. Other way to look at it is whenever you see a ECG, just look at the RR interval. If your T wave ST segment T wave crosses half of your RR interval, then you are looking at a prolonged QT. This is another easy way to see. It should be less than half of RR interval. So if you see your QT interval is crossing more than half of QT interval, then you are having a prolonged QT. Keeping a good eye on QT interval is very important whenever you are looking at a electrolyte imbalance, because most common arrhythmia you're going to see with prolonged QT is a ventricular arrhythmias like Torsades, which are life-threatening. If you are not available, you are not aware of it, and the ECG is not monitored, there is high probability that you may lose the patient. So third one is a 26-year-old man run over by a truck, managed in a local hospital, brought to casualty 24 hours later. Had a multiple head injury, crush injuries. His GCS is 10/15, pressures are 90, and heart rate is 46. He has bradycardia. He was admitted in ICU, was stabilized. This is the ECG. It's a very classical ECG, right? Anybody who just look at the ECG can make a diagnosis. What you can see is a tall, tender T waves, typical. And another thing which is very typical you have to understand is a absence of a P wave. You are not seeing any P waves here. Patient looks like it's in a junctional rhythm. You see a QRS little wider. Patient is in a bradycardia. So you have classical findings of tall, tender T waves, absent P waves, broader QRS, and bradycardia. All this in this patient is going to say that just look at potassium level. That is very important. It's a classical signs of a hyperkalemia. So when you did a bloods, your creatinine is 4.5, potassium is 7.1. So ECG has given a clear clue what to do next. So hyperkalemia is a one electrolyte imbalance which can give you a lot of ECG clues. As your potassium level rises, there is a sequential changes in the ECG. When your potassium levels are in around the range of 6.5 kindish, you will see a tall, tender T waves. Your T waves are becoming upright. Once you reach a level of 7 plus kind of a thing, your T waves still rises further. Slowly, you will start losing your P wave. Losing a P wave is a very dramatic sign of a hyperkalemia. So the earliest sign will be a peaking of your T waves, followed by broadening of QRS, and slowly you lose the P waves. When you lose a P wave, and ultimately when your potassium levels goes more than 10 kind of a thing, patient will develop a sine wave and can have an asyster. So potassium levels are, looking at a potassium levels is very important when you see a subtle changes in your ECG. Whenever you see a any arrhythmia in ICU, see, in a non-cardiac patient, whenever you see arrhythmia, looking at the electrolytes is very, very important, particularly potassium. You have to focus on treating this underlying dysarrhythmia promptly. This is more important. Treat the underlying cause rather than jumping and treating your arrhythmias. Just treat the underlying cause, your arrhythmias will be settled. Why this dysarrhythmia has such a dangerous consequences on your heart? Because all your action potential is completely controlled by your ion channels. These ion channels are nothing but your ion, your positive ions going and negative ions coming out. So when you look at this diagram, you know how your electrolytes are important in keeping your heart rate and all your PR, QT, and QRS interval intact. So you see here. And another thing you have to look at is see the relevance of your potassium channels in cardiac action potentials. Sodium channels are active hardly in your phase 0 and 1, and calcium channels in phase 2, while all other phases potassium is involved. So potassium is an important component of your action potential. Entry and exit of potassium is very important. When you have a hypo or hyperkalemia, your action potential is dramatically affected. And you know very well that the most important phase of your action potential, the most important phase or place where most of the arrhythmias happen is a refractory or repolarization period of your action potential. You see, when your action potential starts recovering from positive to negative, when you start from the middle of this phase to the complete repolarization, this is the phase your heart is very susceptible to arrhythmias. And look at this phase is completely controlled by your potassium. So that's the reason your potassium levels are very important to look at. So if you look at electrolyte imbalance, which can have a significant cardiac manifestations, hypokalemia, hyperkalemia, hypocalcemia, hypercalcemia, hypomagnesemia, they can all have a significant effect on your cardiac action potential, thereby manifesting in an ECG. Others like hyponatremia and hypernatremia, they don't have much of changes. They can have minimal effect. Acidosis and alkalosis, by acting on again potassium and calcium, can have an effect on your action potential. Hyperkalemia, if you look at whenever serum levels are above range, you can have ECG manifestations. Most common cause is usually renal failure, and a lot of our cardiac patients you know very well are on ACE, ARBs, and aldosterone antagonists, which can all cause hyperkalemia in patients who have a relatively fragile renal function. Sinus node can stop, or you don't see any longer P waves when your potassium levels go up more than 7.5. A VF or asystole can occur at the level of 10 to 12. The T waves in hyperkalemia, which is a very important finding. Your T waves in hyperkalemia is typically tall, narrow based. They don't have to be very tall. So your tall is a comparative scale. So tall T wave is usually more than 2 big boxes in a precordial lead, or more than 1 box in a limb leads. Or more importantly, in your mid precordial leads, your T wave is taller than your QRS complex. Then although your T wave by qualitative terms may not be taller, but still is taken as a taller T wave. So you have a taller T wave by qualitative amount more than 2 big boxes, or you have a T wave which is taller than the QRS complex, you call it as a tall T wave. And you know very well that typical hyperkalemia T wave is short based with a peaked appearance. So that's a typical of a hyperkalemia. So what I already told you, what happens to start with, your T waves become taller with a narrow base, and slowly your QRS starts widening. And you will start seeing that your ST segment slowly disappears and taken over by your T wave complex. And T wave grows further and further, and P waves gets absent. And ultimately, by just let's look at the T portion of the figure, and you will see a sinus wave in severe cases. You don't want to allow your patient to reach that stage. So you pick up the hyperkalemia earlier and treat it. The next one is a 52-year-old male, post-antival MI, has a severe LV systolic dysfunction, has a congestive class 4, admitted in CCU with a high dose diuretics, complaints of fatigue and vomiting, which is very common. Most of our heart failure patients are going to complain of this. This is a TAVE1 ECG. Somebody has seen the ECG and look okay, reasonably okay, not to be done anything. And second day, you can see a significant prolongation of QT. The first ECG itself, you can see a prolongation of prolongation of QT interval with appearance of, if you see very closely in V2 and all, you can start to see a T wave. T wave getting prolonger and U wave becoming slowly appearing in the ECG. By day 2, with that itself, patient has continued to have a diuretics. Potassium was not replaced. You see a huge, big, tall, prolonged QT along with a very prominent U wave. So potassium goes further down. You are seeing a very prolonged QT interval. You hardly see a T separately. Your T and U are fused together. You have a prolonged TU wave. So patient has developed a significant QT interval prolongation. So if you look at hypokalemia, these are the common ECG finding you will see a hyperkalemia. The ST segment get depressed. T wave starts to flatten or join U waves. You will start seeing a flattening of T wave with prolongation with a prominent U wave. The U waves slowly will get larger and larger, and they will become at some stage larger than the T wave. And QT interval will slowly prolong. You have to call it as a QT first, then it will become a QU interval. So the QT QU interval will become prolonged, and PR interval also increases because conduction system getting affected due to very low potassium levels. So this is how it looks like. You start developing a flat T with a prominent U. Slowly your T goes further down, U becomes prominent. Ultimately, we end up in a prominent TU wave and with a predominant prolongation of a QT interval. So as these are typical findings you will see as your potassium levels go down further and further. So you can see here, I've done a schematic way how it looks like. Flattening T wave, absent T wave with a prominent U wave. Slowly you become a TU wave, and this QU interval is prolonged very much. This patient is very susceptible to cardiac arrhythmias. If by chance this patient is on digoxin, then arrhythmias. Digoxin is a one drug you have to be very careful because this drug is very dangerous when patient has a hypokalemia. Whenever you are giving a digoxin for a heart failure patient, make sure your potassium levels are checked frequently and you kept at a high normal level. If you look at hypo and hypermagnesemia, you cannot call it as some typical ECG manifestations. Although that hypomagnesemia will have a prolongation of QT interval, and serum levels, unlike your potassium levels, hardly correlate. You may not have a significant like level to level ECG manifestations. So you may have a significant hypomagnesemia, patient may not have a ECG finding so typical of it, but while not so high level of hypermagnesemia, patient can have a shorter QT interval. So they don't correlate that much. So if you look at hypermagnesemia, they are more neurological than cardiac. Hypomagnesemia, you will see a lot of ECG changes. Hypermagnesemia, patient presents with neurological findings than the cardiological findings. A 55-year-old man had a post-CA bladder, presented with ED with abdominal pain, had a weakness and fatigue. Look at this ECG, something is striking. See, whenever you look at a ECG, you have to be schematic. You have to look at rate, rhythm. You finish all that and come back to intervals. Look at all the intervals very clearly. You see a PR interval, QT interval. What is striking here is a shorter QT interval. So this patient had a hypercalcemia. All parameters were within normal range. So when the calcium level goes up, you start developing a shortening of QT interval. Hypercalcemia will result in a short QT interval. This is the one way to identify. Although it's not very correlative, unlike your other electrolyte imbalance, you can identify hypercalcemia by looking at your QT interval. Hypocalcemia, like your hypomagnesemia and hyperkalemia, can cause prolongation of QT. You have to understand that most of the drug you use, like diuretics, are going to deplete potassium, magnesium, and calcium, all three together. So that's the reason you have to be very careful with electrolytes imbalance in patients who are on diuretics, particularly heart failure patients. So hypocalcemia, if you look at hypocalcememia, the prolongation of QT interval is more at the level of ST segment. If you compare with your long QT syndromes, typical long QT syndromes, except for a long QT type 3, where you will have a long ST, other long QT syndromes usually have a prolongation of a ST segment as a whole. But here you will have a long ST segment followed by a small T wave. This is typical of a hypocalcemia induced long QT. By this, you can identify that this may not be a typical congenital long QT syndrome, at least not type 1 and type 2. So both hypo and hypercalcemia are less arrhythmogenic than with potassium levels. They have other manifestations other than cardiological. As I told you, if you have seen the action potential, you know very well that why hypokalemia is so dangerous, because that's the one ion which is involved from all phases of action potential. And more importantly, your repolarization of cardiac potential is brought about by potassium. So anything you are doing at the repolarization is going to make your heart more pro-arrhythmic. And potassium is the ion where it's working on completely on that area. That's the reason the potassium disturbances are the most arrhythmogenic of all. In a single patient, as I told you, multiple electrolyte imbalance can coexist, because reason for having a dyselectrolytemia may be the same drug or same reason. So multiple electrolyte imbalance can coexist. You have to be careful about and correct all of them. If you want me to summarize the findings of electrolyte imbalance, hypokalemia, you will have a decreased T wave amplitude. Slowly your T wave will invert. You can have ST segment depression. You start developing a prominent U wave. Slowly, as your potassium levels goes down, you will have a prolonged QT interval or prolonged Q2U interval, and patient will be very much susceptible to polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, particularly tarsets. Hyperkalemia, which is a milder level, you will have a large amplitude T waves, peaked or tented T waves. When it rises further, you will have a PR interval prolongation. Slowly your P wave amplitude comes down, and ultimately your P wave disappears and QRS prolongs, and you will develop as conduction blocks with escape rhythm, junctional escapes, or a wide ventricular escapes. When it is severe, you will see a sine wave pattern in your ECG that is deadly. Ultimately, the patient will end up in a ventricular fibrillation or a resuscitation. Hypercalcemia, patient will have a prolongation of QT interval. Patient can develop ventricular arrhythmias. As I told you, as a standalone hypercalcemia is less arrhythmogenic, but seeing a standalone hypercalcemia is not very common, except for few patients who have undergone a thyroid surgery or like that, who can have a very low calcium levels and can have a very long prolonged QT intervals and can have ventricular arrhythmias. Otherwise, most often hypocalcemia coexists with other electrolyte imbalance to prolong the QT interval to cause ventricular arrhythmias. Hypercalcemias can cause shortening of Q intervals. In some patients, it can cause bradyarrhythmias. Hypo and hypermagnesemia, there are no unique electrocardiographic abnormalities, but often associated with other calcium abnormalities or potassium abnormalities. They will manifest together rather than alone. But as I already told you, hypomagnesemia is a very important thing to be look out when you have a resistant hypokalemia. That's the one reason your potassium level never goes up until unless you correct hypomagnesemia, your hypokalemia will not be treated. And most importantly, you know, and you have to remember very well, rather than non-cardiac patients, in cardiac patient, these ion imbalance is very important, because most of your antiarrhythmics are going to prolong the QT interval. You have a lot of drugs, you have a lot of interactions with ion channels. In that background, if you have a background electrolyte disturbances, there's a high probability that you will end up in an arrhythmia. First and most important step in identifying all these arrhythmia is being aware of it. So you should know what you are looking at in your ECG. Most importantly, basics. Look at your ECG in a schematic way, regular way, and always when you are a physician or a cardiologist involved in managing sicker patients, having a mind on QT interval is very important. One of the most common part of ECG which is missed most often is a QT interval. If you are aware of it, I always tell all my juniors, the most important thing they have to do is, after writing all the finding, every patients, they have to mention a QT interval. That's how you realize QT is getting prolonged. Otherwise, in a usual daily rounds, you may miss a yearly QT interval prolongation and go on giving the offending drug and ultimately end up in a disastrous ventricular arrhythmias.